The cry in the fields. It was supposed to be just another quiet morning. The kind where the breeze rustles gently through golden crops, and the world moves slow enough for the sun to soak the land in peace. On the outskirts of a forgotten town in Northern California, nestled between mountains and meadows, an old farmer named Clyde Matthews stepped out into his field just after dawn. He was a man molded by the land, wrinkled, steady, with hands rough from decades of labor. A widower for many years, Clyde had no children of his own, only a weathered dog named Rufus and the memory of his wife, Lillian, whose photo still sat on the dusty mantel of his farmhouse. Clyde didn't expect anything to change that day, but as he passed the fence line, his ears caught a strange sound, soft at first, like the wind whimpering. He paused, heart skipping. Then came the unmistakable sound, a baby crying. He froze. Was it an animal? No, it was unmistakably human. His old boots thudded across the soil as he rushed toward the source, heart racing faster than it had in years. Behind the tall stalks of corn, nestled beneath an old oak tree, lay something that would change everything. A blanket, moving, crying. And then, 3 of them. 3 infants wrapped in worn but clean cloths, barely a few months old. 2 girls, 1 boy, all left together in a hand-woven basket, resting on the grass like a secret dropped from heaven. Clyde dropped to his knees, stunned. Who would leave babies out here in the middle of nowhere? His thoughts spun into chaos. Danger, exposure, cold, but instinct took over. He scooped them up carefully, holding them against his chest, all 3 whimpering, squirming, needing. He whispered softly, "It's all right now. You're safe." He rushed back to the house, barking at Rufus to move aside, and dialed 911. The local sheriff's office responded within minutes. Emergency responders arrived, cradling the babies with concern, assuring Clyde they'd be taken care of. But something lingered. Something in Clyde's chest felt different, an ache, a pull. He'd seen things in his long life, but never this. The babies didn't just show up on his land. They showed up in his world, and it felt deliberate. Fated, even. Miles away in Los Angeles. At the exact same time, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in a modest corner cafe in West Hollywood. Unshaven, dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, he blended in, just how he liked it. The world knew him as a Hollywood icon, a beloved actor who had managed to remain humble in a town known for swallowing its own. But Keanu wasn't there to talk about films or fame. He was nursing a cup of herbal tea and staring at his phone. A message from a friend, an independent journalist named Danielle Monroe, had just come through. "You need to see this. Weird story out of NorCal. 3 babies abandoned on a farm. Locals are calling it a miracle. The farmer's name is Clyde Matthews. Something about this feels strange." Keanu frowned. He wasn't a stranger to tragic stories. He'd lived through his own. The loss of his daughter Eva, the passing of Jennifer, the woman he once thought he'd grow old with. Life had carved sorrow into his soul, but it had also shaped his relentless desire to help. Not with headlines or press tours, but with quiet, meaningful action. So when Danielle sent him a follow-up voice message, a soft, trembling clip of the farmer describing the moment he found the babies, Keanu felt something stir deep inside him. He couldn't explain it. He didn't need to. He just knew he had to go. Back at the farm, the sheriff's department was still investigating. No cameras, no footprints, no signs of anyone in the area. The only clue was a note tucked into the blanket that simply read, "Please protect them. Their lives depend on it." The town buzzed with gossip. Was it a mother in distress? A trafficking escape? A cult? No one knew. But the story began spreading online, and soon it reached more eyes than anyone expected, especially Keanu's. By the next afternoon, a black SUV pulled up near Clyde's property. A dust cloud trailed behind it, and Rufus barked from the porch as the door opened. Keanu stepped out, squinting in the sunlight. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Wait a minute, is that?" Clyde stood at the edge of his field, hoe in hand, his flannel shirt soaked in sweat. He watched as the man approached, walking slowly, almost cautiously. "Mr. Matthews," Keanu said, extending a hand. "I'm Keanu. I heard about what happened. I wanted to help, if you'll let me." Clyde took his hand, gripped it firm. "Ain't every day a movie star shows up at my farm." "I'm not here as a movie star," Keanu replied quietly. "I'm here as a man who believes in miracles. The beginning of something bigger." The next few days unfolded like a whirlwind. The babies, temporarily named Hope, Lily, and Jonah, were placed in protective custody, pending investigation. But Clyde visited every day, sitting beside them in the small-town clinic, telling them stories of soil and seasons, sunshine and strength. And Keanu, he stayed, quietly, anonymously. He helped fix Clyde's fence, cooked him dinner, slept in the guest room above the barn. They talked long into the nights, about loss, about love, about the strange timing of it all. Keanu learned that Clyde's wife, Lillian, had wanted children but couldn't have them. That she'd once whispered, "Maybe one day, the land will give us something unexpected." And it had. A deepening mystery. Meanwhile, the investigation uncovered something chilling. DNA tests revealed the infants were not biologically related, yet had been left together, intentionally. Even stranger, one of the babies had a microchip embedded near her shoulder. Not a medical chip. A prototype tracker, like something from a tech lab. Keanu called Danielle. "What if these babies weren't just abandoned?" he asked. "What if they were running from something?" Danielle's voice crackled through the phone. "I think you're onto something, Keanu. And I think whoever put them there might come back." The promise. On his last night at the farm before heading back to LA for a film shoot, Keanu stood under the stars beside Clyde, who held little Hope in his arms. "They've changed you," Keanu said. "They reminded me I ain't done living yet," Clyde replied. Keanu smiled. "If you need anything, anything at all, I'm here." Clyde nodded. "Funny thing. My wife always said the land gives you what you need, just not always how you expect it." Keanu looked out across the fields, the night alive with cricket song. He had no idea that everything was about to unravel, because someone was watching the farm. And those babies were never supposed to survive. Whispers in the wind. The next morning came with a strange quiet over the farm. Clyde stood at the porch, his mug of black coffee cradled in both hands, watching the horizon. The sun had barely risen, yet the sky glowed with that soft, peach-orange hue only found in the early hours of truth. Behind him, inside the house, one of the babies stirred from a nap, their small cries like wind chimes in a breeze, faint yet unmistakable. Keanu had stayed one more night. Something in his gut told him to. He wasn't one to ignore intuition. It had saved his life more than once, both in films and far more quietly in real life. The night before, after the firewood was stacked and dinner dishes cleaned, he'd spent hours walking the field edge with Rufus, flashlight in hand, scanning the brush, feeling that strange sensation in his chest again, like something was off balance, like the universe had tilted slightly in his direction, asking him to notice. Clyde didn't say much, but Keanu could read it in his eyes. He felt it too. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent. Uncertainty. The kind that settles into your bones when you know your life has changed forever and you don't yet understand why. Inside the farmhouse, the scent of cinnamon toast filled the air. Keanu had found an old jar of ground cinnamon in the cupboard and insisted on making breakfast. As the toast browned, he glanced at the folded piece of paper still on the kitchen table, the note that had been tucked into the baby's blanket. "Please protect them. Their lives depend on it." Those words lingered more than they should have. Keanu had asked to take a picture of it. Danielle had someone she trusted. a handwriting analyst, a woman who had worked with missing persons cases for over 2 decades. She had agreed to take a look at it, discreetly. Clyde walked back into the kitchen, his boots creaking against the wood. "Storm's comin'," he muttered, nodding toward the window. "Can feel it in my knees. Always had a way of knowin'." Keanu smiled gently, setting a plate of toast on the table. "Then we'll be ready for it." But neither of them were prepared for what came next. The babies, Hope, Lily, and Jonah, had been placed under temporary foster care with a kind nurse named Maribel, just a few miles from the farm. She was middle-aged, single, and deeply respected in the small community. She'd lost her own child years ago and felt an immediate connection to the infants. Clyde had insisted on visiting every day. So had Keanu, at least while he was in town. He'd rented a pickup from a local lot and had already driven it more miles in 1 week than he usually did in a month. But that morning, as the sky turned gray and the wind picked up, Maribel's house phone rang. She wasn't expecting visitors. The sheriff's department had assured her they were increasing patrols, just in case. Still, she lived far enough from town that it would take time for help to reach her. The voice on the other end of the line was male. Calm. Cold. "You're harboring what doesn't belong to you." Maribel's hand trembled. "Who is this?" But the line went dead. She checked every lock, held the babies tighter, and called the sheriff immediately. The investigation had already begun to shift into new territory. Danielle, Keanu's journalist friend, had called back that same morning. Her voice was serious. "The chip in the baby's shoulder. It's not a medical implant. It's a prototype developed by a private defense tech firm in Nevada. Not officially on record, buried in corporate contracts. They're developing tracking systems for, not weapons exactly, but something more advanced. Something that involves genetics." Keanu leaned back in his truck seat, foam pressed tightly to his ear. "You're telling me these babies might have been part of some kind of experiment?" "I don't want to jump to conclusions," Danielle said carefully. "But yes, or their parents were. Either way, someone is looking for them, and whoever left them on that farm wanted them to be hidden." He stared out across the open field. The wind was rising now, sending ripples across the grass like the ocean surface. "Then we need to find out who. And why." That afternoon, Keanu drove back to Maribel's, just as the clouds began to gather overhead. When she opened the door, her face was pale. "I think someone was watching the house," she whispered. "A man, just beyond the tree line. Tall. I saw his silhouette, and then he disappeared." Keanu's voice was calm. "Did you call the sheriff?" "They came and swept the area. Didn't find anything. But the babies, they were restless all night, like they knew something." Hope had cried the longest. Her tiny hands clutched at the air, as if reaching for something invisible. Keanu picked her up gently, held her against his chest. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." But inside, he wasn't so sure. He wasn't afraid for himself. That part of him had been burned away long ago. By loss, by life, by a long road filled with shadows. But these children, they were the beginning of something else. Something bigger. And something was coming. Back on the farm, Clyde found something unusual near the oak tree where he'd discovered the babies days ago. Tire tracks. Not from his truck. These were wider, fresh, but Clyde hadn't heard an engine. No one had been by. He crouched beside them, eyes narrowing. Then he spotted something glinting beneath a bush, partially buried in dirt. A silver keychain. It was shaped like a phoenix. Unfamiliar. Foreign. But he pocketed it and drove straight to town. The sheriff examined it but couldn't trace it. No fingerprints. No logos. Nothing. Just that strange phoenix, carved with intense detail, wings wide, rising in flame. Keanu, upon seeing it, felt a strange flicker of recognition. Not from real life, but from a script he once read, years ago, about a covert genetic project hidden behind symbols and myth. Was it coincidence? Or was something far more deliberate unfolding? That evening, as thunder cracked the sky and rain began to fall in sheets, Clyde sat beside the fireplace, Jonah sleeping in his arms. Keanu was by the window, watching lightning flicker across the distant ridge. The farmhouse felt like a ship in a storm, old, sturdy, but surrounded by forces beyond its control. Clyde looked up at Keanu. "You think we're in over our heads?" Keanu didn't turn away from the glass. "Probably. But that's not what matters." "Then what does?" He turned then, finally meeting Clyde's eyes. "That we stand. No matter how deep the water gets. We protect them. We figure it out. Together." Outside, the rain pounded the earth, but inside, there was warmth. Determination. A quiet understanding that whatever storm was coming, whatever truth lay buried beneath the mystery, these men were no longer alone. And neither were the children. But far away, in a sleek high-rise office overlooking a distant city, a man in a tailored black suit stared at a digital map glowing red. 3 blinking lights. Then 2. Then none. He frowned, tapped a button on his desk. A female voice responded instantly. "We lost their signals again." "Find them," the man ordered, "before the world finds out what they really are." And with that, the hunt began. Beneath the silence. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the thunder ever had. Clyde stood alone on his porch, a mug of tea forgotten in his hands. The sun was rising again, casting soft golden light over fields, still damp from the night's downpour. The earth smelled of renewal, mud, grass, rain, but to Clyde, something about it all felt still. Too still. Even the birds weren't singing. Inside the farmhouse, Keanu was already awake, crouched beside the fireplace. He had barely slept. The babies had settled down after a restless night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that the peace around them was not peace at all, but a pause in something bigger. The kind of stillness that comes before a wave crashes. He stared at the fireplace for a long moment, lost in thought. Something about the keychain, the phoenix Clyde had found, stayed with him, rising from fire, escaping death. Transformation. It wasn't just a symbol. It felt like a message. Upstairs, Maribel was dressing Hope, her gentle voice humming a lullaby as the infant blinked sleepily. She had taken up temporary shelter in Clyde's guest room after the strange call and the shadow outside her house. Neither she nor Keanu trusted that the babies were safe out there anymore, and neither of them had wanted to separate them. Not now. As Keanu came up the stairs, he heard her voice falter. She was staring at Hope's tiny shoulder. "What is it?" he asked softly. Maribel looked up, eyes wide with concern. "The chip. It's gone." He moved closer. She was right. Where the small raised bump once had been, there was now only smooth skin. No mark. No scar. No trace. "It was here," Maribel whispered. "I checked it myself. It was real." Keanu crouched, gently lifting Hope's arm to confirm. Nothing. It hadn't fallen out. It had dissolved. Or worse, been remotely deactivated. That same morning, Danielle arrived. She had driven all night, something she hadn't done since her early reporting days. The urgency in her last few calls had grown stronger by the hour, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Keanu met her at the gate. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her determination was sharp. "I did some digging," she said, sliding out of her car, laptop bag slung across her shoulder. "The Phoenix keychain. It's used internally by a security division under a shell company called Veracor. They're not in any public records, but they've been quietly buying up patents related to genetic encryption and behavioral biometrics." Keanu frowned. "In English." Danielle glanced around. "In English, it means they're experimenting on human lives. Probably infants, possibly to engineer something." "Something like what?" She hesitated. "Like children who could adapt faster, heal faster, maybe remember more." Babies bred not just to survive, but to evolve. Clyde had stepped up onto the porch just as she said it. His face didn't change, but his eyes did. He looked toward the window, where the 3 babies were asleep in a wooden crib he built by hand. "Lord," he muttered, "what kind of world are we living in?" That afternoon, Keanu and Danielle drove into town, not for errands, but to meet someone she believed might help. His name was Elijah Turner, a former biotech developer who had once consulted on a DARPA-funded project years ago, only to resign midway and vanish into a quiet life in a nearby valley. She'd found him through a contact, a woman he trusted. When she called and mentioned the chip, the Phoenix, and the babies, he agreed to one meeting. Keanu didn't speak much during the ride. He sat in the passenger seat of Danielle's SUV, eyes focused on the road, hands tapping slowly against his jeans. When they arrived at the cabin, a moss-covered wooden structure nestled in a grove of sycamore trees, Elijah was already outside, waiting. Late 50s, graying beard, denim jacket, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and survived it. "I know why you're here," he said before they even introduced themselves, "and I don't want to be dragged back in. But if there are children involved, I'll tell you what I know." They sat in his garden, birds fluttering in the trees above as Elijah began to speak in low tones. There was a project, years ago, codenamed ECHO. It stood for Enhanced Cognitive Human Optimization. On paper, it was about treating neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, brain trauma. But behind closed doors, it became something else. They started recruiting expectant mothers from vulnerable backgrounds. No family, no paper trail. Promised them free medical care. What they were really doing was manipulating the infants before birth. Keanu's jaw clenched. And these kids, they survived. Elijah nodded grimly. A few. Most didn't, but 3 of them were different. They weren't born in hospitals. They were taken off the grid, never meant to be seen again. Danielle's eyes narrowed. Then why were they left on Clyde's land? Elijah leaned back, sighing. "I don't know. But if someone saved them from ECHO, then someone inside the system had a change of heart. Maybe even a parent." He stood, walking over to a small lock shed near the trees. When he returned, he handed Keanu a black notebook. "These are my notes. From before I quit. You'll find something in there that might help you." As they drove back, Keanu leafed through the journal, eyes scanning diagrams, notes, coordinates, and a list of 3 names, all marked as MIA. At the bottom of the page, scribbled hastily, "If they surface, protect them. The Phoenix is watching." Back at the farm, the sky had gone gray again. Maribel was packing a bag for the children, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't feel safe anymore. Not here, not anywhere. Clyde watched her from the doorway. "You're thinking of leaving." "I have to," she said, her voice tight. "They're not safe here." Clyde nodded slowly. "Then I'll come with you." Maribel looked up, surprised. "What? You shouldn't do it alone. And those babies. I may not be much, but I know how to build, fix, and protect. Always said I'd never leave this land. But I reckon I'd leave it for the right reason." Outside, thunder rumbled again. That night, Keanu returned with Danielle, just as lightning flickered across the sky. He handed Elijah's notebook to Clyde, who studied it in silence. Then Keanu knelt beside the crib, gently brushing a hand over each child's head. "We need to move them," he said. "Tonight." And they did. In the middle of the night, as rain returned and wind picked up, they loaded the babies, quietly and carefully, into Maribel's van. Clyde rode in front, shotgun cradled beside his boots. Danielle drove. Keanu followed in his truck. No one spoke, but as they passed the edge of the field, headlights flickered in the rearview mirror, briefly, then vanished. Someone was following them. and the race to protect the children had truly begun. Roads we never meant to take. The rain fell harder as the two vehicles rolled down the winding backroads of Northern California. Maribel's van led the way, headlights cutting through the mist, windshield wipers battling the downpour in rhythmic desperation. Clyde sat in the passenger seat, eyes scanning the tree lines, fingers drumming against the handle of the shotgun resting at his feet. Behind them, in his dusty old truck, Keanu followed with calm intensity, his eyes flicking from the road to the rearview mirror again and again. For a while, there was only darkness and rain, no sign of anyone behind them. But they all felt it. They were being washed. They drove for hours without speaking. The babies, miraculously, slept through the storm, tucked safely in the back seat with warm blankets and small knitted caps Maribel had made herself. Danielle had found a safe house, an old cabin owned by a friend of hers, deep in the redwoods, unreachable without four-wheel drive and invisible on digital maps. It was the kind of place designed for disappearing. But even the deepest woods can't keep out what's meant to find you. By the time they reached the cabin, dawn was just beginning to push against the horizon. The storm had moved inland, leaving the forest soaked and steaming. The cabin sat low among towering trees, almost hidden beneath a canopy of ancient branches. Ferns brushed against the tires as they parked, and silence returned, too deep, too full. Keanu stepped out first, scanning the area. He'd barely spoken during the drive. Something in him had shifted since reading Elijah's notebook. He had carried it with him, flipping through pages in the dim glow of the truck's overhead light whenever they stopped at gas stations or quiet intersections. One page wouldn't leave his mind. It described a subject, labeled Unit H3. Not by name, not by gender, just a string of encrypted data followed by a single phrase: high empathetic retention, behavioral absorption, bonds rapidly. Keanu didn't know why it bothered him so much, until he remembered something. Years ago, long before the fame, before the tragedy, back when he'd done a small indie film in Nevada. He'd volunteered at a prenatal care clinic between shoots. Quiet work, no cameras, just kindness. There had been a young woman there, scared, alone. She was pregnant. The staff said she didn't talk much, but she talked to him. They shared tea once. She cried the whole time, said something about them watching her, about not being able to keep the baby. Her name had been Layla. And suddenly, Keanu remembered what she had whispered as he left the clinic that day. If anything ever happens, if they come for her, find the one with the fire. The one with the fire. The Phoenix. His hand shook slightly as he clutched the journal tighter. Could that woman have been involved in the same program? Was her child, her daughter, one of these three? And why, out of all the people in the world, had the babies ended up on that farm? Why had he felt drawn to them so powerfully? Inside the cabin, Maribel laid the babies in a large makeshift crib built from pinewood crates and blankets. Danielle began setting up her laptop, connecting through a secure offline server she'd prepared for this very scenario. Clyde, meanwhile, checked every door and window, reinforcing locks with thick timber boards he found in the woodshed. He moved like a man with purpose, a man who had spent a lifetime waiting for something, and now that it had come, he would not be caught unprepared. Keanu stood in the corner of the room, staring out the fogged-up window, his thoughts loud in the silence. "You okay?" Danielle asked, finally breaking the hush. "I don't know," he replied softly, his eyes not leaving the trees. "But I think I know why they were brought to us." Danielle stepped closer. "What do you mean?" He turned slowly, his voice hushed like he was revealing a secret even the room wasn't ready to hear. "I think I met the mother of one of them. Years ago, she was scared, running from something. She didn't say much, but I remember what she told me. About the Phoenix, about fire, and about someone finding her child." Danielle looked at him, something dawning in her eyes. "Keanu, what if it wasn't random? What? What if this wasn't just fate? What if it was planned? What if she chose you? The room fell still. Keanu looked over at the sleeping babies. Hope stirred gently in her blanket, one tiny hand curling around a strand of cloth. Her skin was pale, but her cheeks had a natural warmth to them, as if lit from within. "Then I'm not letting anyone take them," he said, voice firm. Outside, the fog was beginning to clear. But what they couldn't see, hidden just beyond the tree line, were three figures in black tactical gear, crouched in silence, watching the cabin through infrared lenses. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others to hold. "Not yet," a voice said into a comms device. "We wait until dark, then retrieve the assets." Back inside, Danielle had begun uploading pieces of the ledge's notes to a private contact she trusted in the federal system, a whistleblower she'd worked with before. If they could prove the existence of Project EC, they might be able to force exposure, maybe even protection. But it was a race against time. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Clyde looked up from the fireplace. "Generator." Danielle frowned. "It's fully charged." The lights flickered again, then died. Everything went black. Keanu grabbed the flashlight and checked the panel outside. The generator was intact. No damage. No signs of tampering. Then came a sound. Low, whirring, mechanical, like something scanning the area. He looked up and saw a small black drone hovering just above the treetops, its red eye blinking like a heartbeat. "Everyone inside!" he yelled, bolting toward the door. In the cabin, Maribel grabbed the babies and crouched behind the couch. Clyde took position near the door, gun ready. Danielle slammed her laptop shut and slid it into her pack. Keanu burst through the door, slamming it behind him. "They found us. We have minutes." They moved with precision, quiet, focused. Keanu lifted Jonah gently from Maribel's arms, Clyde taking Lily. Danielle cradled Hope. "There's a trail behind the shed," Clyde said. "It leads down into the ravine. No roads, no cameras, just forest." They didn't argue. As the sound of drone blades grew louder, they slipped out the back door and vanished into the woods. 3 infants, 4 protectors, and a truth too dangerous to be left behind. The forest swallowed them whole. Twilight descended quickly, casting long shadows between the trees. Branches cracked under hurried feet. No one spoke. Every breath was reserved for movement. The babies remained quiet, as if they knew. Keanu moved at the back, scanning for threats. Danielle led the way with Clyde beside her, his old instincts sharper than ever. They found a cave by the ravine, a natural shelter hidden behind thick vines. Clyde had known about it since childhood, but hadn't set foot near it in decades. They slid inside, breaths ragged, bodies soaked. For now, they were safe. But Keanu knew better. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because deep in his bones, he understood now, these children weren't just survivors of a failed experiment. They were the key to something the world wasn't ready for, and someone would do anything to claim them, even if it meant taking everything he had left. Ashes don't lie. Inside the cave, time seemed to bend. The silence was alive, not peaceful, but tight, waiting. Outside, the forest whispered with the weight of wind and morning. The air smelled of wet soil and damp leaves, and the soft flicker of Clyde's flashlight carved pale halos along the mossy walls. Keanu sat with Jonah in his arms, the baby warm against his chest, heartbeats sensing like drumbeats of a promise. Danielle leaned against a rock, eyes glued to the screen of her offline laptop, the faint blue glow painting her face in shadowy hues. She was decrypting the last pages from Elijah's journal, the part he'd never dared to send digitally. Clyde kept watch near the entrance, holding the shotgun across his lap like it was part of him. And Maribel. She held both girls close, humming a tune that neither she nor the babies fully understood, but somehow it kept the cold away. "I found something," Danielle finally whispered. All heads turned. Keanu moved closer, careful not to wake Jonah. The screen showed a scanned document, rough and raw, like it had been torn from a file folder and photographed in haste. On it, 3 names. No surnames, just first names and codes beside them. Lily, H2. Jonah, H3. Hope, H4. What happened to H1? Keanu asked quietly. Danielle scrolled further. There it was. Subject H1. Terminated. LM. Carrier. Severe emotional retention. Dissolved under duress. She paused. LM, she said softly. Layla. Maybe Layla Morgan. Keanu's body went still. The weight of Jonah in his arms somehow grew heavier, like he was carrying more than just a child now, but history, grief, and a truth he never asked for. That was her name, he said. The woman I met. Years ago. Layla Morgan. I didn't know her last name back then. But that's her. Clyde slowly stood up. You saying one of these kids is hers? Keanu nodded, staring down at Jonah. I think this one is her son. A low crack echoed from deep in the forest, like a branch breaking beneath a heavy step. Clyde was up in a heartbeat, shotgun raised, flashlight off. He motioned for everyone to keep quiet. Keanu gently handed Jonah to Maribel and moved toward the mouth of the cave, crouching beside Clyde. They didn't speak. They just listened. There it was again, closer this time. A crunch of leaves. Then silence. Then 2 more steps. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small steel blade he always kept on him. Not for show. For real. Something he'd learned from old friends on movie sets, how to stay ready without looking ready. Then, a figure emerged. Not from the trees. From above the cave, sliding down on a silent rope, dressed in dark matte tactical gear. His face was covered, visor reflecting the dim moonlight. He landed just feet from the cave's entrance, silent as a shadow. Clyde fired. The shot echoed like thunder, slamming into a nearby tree, just missing the intruder by inches. The man rolled, fast and fluid, but he didn't fire back. He raised his hands instead. And then he spoke. I'm not here to hurt you. His voice was steady, calm, almost too calm. Keanu stepped forward, knife lowered but not dropped. Then start talking. The man slowly removed his helmet. Beneath it was a face far younger than they expected. Late 20s. Clear-eyed. No anger. Just wait. My name is Gabriel. I was born inside ECHO. I escaped 5 years ago. And I've been trying to find those children ever since. Inside the cave, the tension hung thick. Keanu motioned for Gabriel to sit, but his eyes never left him. Clyde didn't lower the shotgun. Gabriel looked at each of them, carefully, methodically, until his gaze landed on Hope, curled in Maribel's arms. She's the last, he whispered. They called her the linchpin. Everything was designed around her genetic sequence. Danielle stepped forward. Explain. Now. Gabriel took a breath, the kind that comes before a confession. There were 5 of us. I was the prototype, G1, not a child. A teenager. They were refining the experiment. By the time they reached the infants, they discovered something terrifying. These kids weren't just engineered for intelligence or resilience. He glanced at Hope again. They were built to learn from emotions, absorb everything. Pain, joy, loss, and use it. Not as memories, but as blueprints. They can mirror behavior down to a neurological level. That's why ECHO wanted them back. Not to raise them, not to help them. To control them, Keanu said quietly. Gabriel nodded. They're afraid of what these kids might become without the programming. Without the obedience. They want to install control chips, software-level suppression, make them weapons, perfect operatives. Clyde muttered, over my dead body. Keanu's jaw tightened. They're not getting them. Gabriel met his eyes. That's why I'm here. to help you disappear before they find you, because they're closer than you think. Gabriel led them through the forest just before dawn. There was an old network of tunnels, once used by miners in the late 1800s, now long forgotten, except by him. He'd used them to escape. Now he was using them to save others. They moved quickly but carefully. Keanu carried Jonah. Danielle had Lily. Clyde helped Maribel with Hope. The babies stayed asleep, somehow sensing the urgency, yet responding with calm, like part of them already understood. The tunnels were damp, narrow, filled with echoes of old lives and newer fears. Along the way, they passed faded carvings in stone, initials, old miner symbols, forgotten dates, a strange comfort in knowing even the earth remembered. Gabriel stopped at a junction. "This splits," he said. "I have a contact who can take you across the border. Safe, undocumented, off the grid. But only if we move fast. You have maybe 12 hours before the next drone scan." Keanu stepped forward. "What about you?" Gabriel hesitated. "I'm staying. I need to cover your tracks." Clyde shook his head. "You're just a kid." Gabriel smiled, sad and strong. "Not anymore." They parted ways with quiet handshakes and no words. Keanu clapped Gabriel on the shoulder, a silent thank you passing between them. Then they slipped deeper into the dark, toward freedom. At dusk, miles away, in a sterile lab beneath a corporate high-rise, a man in a gray suit stared at a blinking red dot on a monitor. "They've moved again," his assistant said. The man didn't flinch. He simply turned, lit a cigarette, and muttered, "Let them run. They always do. But fire catches." He opened a locked drawer, revealing a small steel case. Inside, 3 vials shimmered in dim blue light, labeled H2, H3, H4. The case was emptying, and there was only one left to claim. Back in the woods, the group emerged from the tunnel into a mountain clearing. A cabin stood just ahead, weathered, forgotten, and completely hidden by nature. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Someone was waiting. An old woman stepped out, hair white as frost, skin like crumpled linen, but her eyes, clear and sharp. "You must be Keanu," she said with a grin. "Layla told me you'd come." Keanu's breath caught. "You knew her?" "I did," she said, nodding. "She was my daughter." The fire within. Keanu didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, eyes locked on the old woman who had just stepped from the cabin, as if she had known the script of their lives long before the rest of them even realized they were characters in a larger story. Her name was Miriam, and her presence held the air still, like the calm in the center of a storm. "She was my daughter," Miriam repeated, voice steady despite the years of grief behind it. "Layla. Fierce. Quiet. Too brave for her own good." Keanu finally nodded, his throat tight. "She told me once, if anything happened to her, to look for the one with fire." Miriam smiled sadly. "She meant Hope, but she also meant you." The words hit deeper than he expected. All this time, Keanu had tried to stay in the background, to help without drawing attention, to give without needing to be part of the story. But now he realized he was part of it. He always had been. Layla had chosen him not by accident, but because she saw something in him the world often overlooked. A kind of fire that didn't roar but glowed, persistent, unwavering, kind. The cabin was safe. Miriam had lived off the grid for decades, in a place no satellite would find unless it was told exactly where to look. Inside, the wood stove crackled. The air smelled of cedar and healing. And for the first time in days, the children were allowed to rest without fear, their soft breathing like tiny waves lapping against the quiet shores of peace. Clyde sat beside the fire, rubbing his tired hands together. He hadn't said much since they arrived, but there was something in his posture, relaxed, grounded, that hadn't been there before. Danielle was outside, walking the perimeter with Miriam, learning everything she could. She was already building the story in her head. How to expose ECKO, how to protect the children from becoming pawns in someone else's war. Maribel rocked Lily gently in her arms, a quiet lullaby on her lips. She had become something of a mother to them all, not just the babies, but the broken hearts in the room too. And Keanu. He sat on the floor beside the crib, watching Jona's little fingers wrap around his own. They had found refuge. But refuge was not the end. Later that night, Miriam sat Keanu down at the kitchen table. Between them sat a dusty box, old, wooden, carved with a phoenix just like the one on the keychain Clyde had found. She opened it slowly, revealing documents, photos, and a worn leather-bound journal. "My daughter kept this," she said. "Everything she knew. Everything she risked her life to uncover. Before they found out." Keanu thumbed through the pages. Handwritten notes, diagrams, test schedules. But what struck him most were the sketches of 3 children, each one labeled not by code, but by a name. Hope, Jonah, and Lily. "She named them," he whispered. "She loved them," Miriam said. "They weren't just experiments to her. They were miracles. She tried to escape with all 5. One didn't make it. One was recaptured. But 3 she managed to hide. She knew the only way they'd survive was if she placed them somewhere they'd be protected, loved. And she knew she wouldn't survive long enough to do it herself. So she chose Clyde's land," Keanu said, the realization dawning. Miriam nodded. "Your kindness reached her when no one else's did. She told me you didn't try to fix her, you just listened. That was enough." A long silence fell between them. Not heavy. Sacred. Then Keanu looked up. "What happens now?" The next morning, a message came through Danielle's secure channel. Gabriel had succeeded in planting false trails. The organization was confused, divided, searching in the wrong directions. But that wouldn't last forever. "You have maybe 2 weeks before the trail turns cold," he said in the recorded message. "Use that time to vanish. For real." Keanu gathered the group. They stood beneath the tall trees, sunlight filtering through branches like a blessing. They had to make a decision. "We can't keep running," Clyde said plainly. "Not forever." "No," Keanu agreed. "But we can build something better." That afternoon, they made a plan. Miriam would stay at the cabin and care for the children as their legal guardian. Danielle had already begun the legal groundwork. Clyde, too old to keep running, chose to stay as well. He'd spent his life caring for soil and seed. Now he'd care for children who were growing into something even more precious. Maribel, though quiet, chose to stay too. "This is what I was meant for," she said softly. "Not just nursing. Loving." Danielle would return to the world above, armed with evidence, recordings, and names. She knew the risks, but her fire burned just as brightly as the children's. "I'll make them regret everything," she promised. And Keanu. He looked at the babies, then at Miriam, at Clyde, at the sky. He felt the weight of destiny on his shoulders. And then, somehow, lighter. Not because it disappeared, but because he finally embraced it. "I'll stay until they don't need me anymore," he said. "Then I'll stay longer." Months passed. Spring gave way to summer. The cabin became a home. Hope learned to walk first, her steps wobbly but determined. Jonah followed, always chasing after birds and butterflies. Lily was the quiet one, watchful, wise, always near a book or a leaf or someone's hand. Keanu built them a play area by the stream. Clyde carved each of their names into the posts. Maribel planted flowers along the trail, and Miriam read to them every night from Layla's journal, so they would never forget where they came from or how deeply they were loved. And Danielle. She released the story. It took time. But the world eventually listened. The scandal broke. Protests followed. An investigation. Then more. ECHO was exposed. No one ever traced it back to the cabin. No one ever came looking again. Years later, an older Keanu stood under the same tree where he'd once made his promise to protect. The children were older now, thriving, not as test subjects, not as weapons, but as people. Empathetic, kind, brilliant. Hope wanted to be a doctor. Jonah talked about the stars. Lily wrote stories that made everyone cry. And Keanu, he still walked the woods at dusk, still fixed the porch when it creaked, still sat beside the fire each night with a cup of tea and a notebook full of scribbles he never showed anyone. He had once been the quiet hero in someone else's story, but now he had become the father figure in 3 new ones, because kindness doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a heart that keeps showing up, even when no one's watching. And in a world that once tried to claim their futures, it was kindness, not control, that saved them forever.